X-Men versus the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A couple of friends of mine watched X-Men Apocalypse because it released digitally. I walked away from X-Men still liking it as much as I did the first time. You know, X-Men Apocalypse isn't the most brilliant film, but it's still a fun film. I walked away thinking, I don't have any desire to see Captain America Civil War. And I was like, why is that? You know, I normally enjoy Marvel films, so what's changed the last few films? What has kind of begun to make me feel less inclined to want to follow the ongoing MCU saga? There's a reason why I gravitate more towards X-Men than I am the MCU at the moment. So I'm going to chat themes, villains, relationships, and character growth throughout the series. So X-Men is a huge range of themes that they deal with from film to film. I mean, the first film in 2000 is all about, you know, kind of acceptance and dealing with, you know, living in a very hostile world and environment. X-Men 2 is about kind of belonging, you know, finding out and understanding, you know, where do you belong, where is the good place for you to be. X-Men 3 is more about ethical questions, you know, how, you know, as Professor Xavier is manipulating Jean, and, you know, we learn some of the stuff about how he suppressed some of her power. So it's like, is that good? Is that bad? Should he have done that? And it kind of explores that along with the mutant cure stuff. So it's kind of like, oh, should we cure ourselves? You know, is there anything to cure? Is being a mutant bad? Is it good? That kind of stuff. Then you have the Wolverine film, and the Wolverine is dealing with his pain and regret from having to kill Jean to save the world, basically. And it's very emotional for him, and he's kind of become a, you know, recluse from those events. And then you kind of go back to the prequel trilogy. So you have, you know, First Class, where you have Xavier, who's, you know, fresh out of uni. He believes in hope, he believes in a bright future. But then you have Magneto, who is vengeful and hate filled because of what's happened to him and his parents throughout the Holocaust. Completely understandable. So it's all about trying to wrestle with those themes of, can we peacefully coexist? And then Days of Future Past is that culmination, really. You know, X-Men 3 was supposed to be the, you know, the last stand, the big fight for peaceful coexistence, but didn't really do very well because it's a shit film. But Days of Future Past is where that is solidified, you know, hope for the future, and hope for the future is now found in the past. You know, Xavier is you know, he feels like he's failed, he's, you know, completely, you know, off on his own, he's, you know, he's given up on his powers. You know, then you go into the future and everything is dire. That is literally the last stand. They're about to all be snuffed out. So it's dealing with that, you know, kind of that last stretch, that last glimmer of hope. And then X-Men Apocalypse is all about the kind of you know, God complex, someone who believes they should be worshipped and everyone should bow to their wills. What I like about the X-Men themes, they're not just kind of sugar-coated themes. You know, they're thoroughly explored. Whatever that film's theme is, you know, is pushed from the beginning all the way through to the end until they've reached some sort of conclusion. The films as well do a really good job of picking new and different themes to have the characters engage with and learn and experience. Themes in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Iron Man 1 is, you know, all about, you know, the Tin Man who has to go, you know, find himself a heart. And that was done really well. I think Iron Man 1 is a brilliant film. It was different, it was unique, it had a great kind of sense of you know, humor, but at the same time really embraced, you know, being a comic book film in a just an incredibly fun way. It was just nice and refreshing from what we had seen, because around the time Iron Man came out, a lot of comic book films had failed. You know, then Iron Man 2 kind of gets away from itself. You know, they want to explore Tony's alcoholism, but they fail miserably and just turn it into, you know, Tony's bad weekend. You know, this is a guy who does deal with this kind of stuff, and it's worth exploring because people do struggle with this stuff. So when you kind of paint it over like, oh, it's absolutely fine, then it's like, you've really missed a trick here. Iron Man 3 brings things around a little bit better. Tony still has demons in his past. You know, he's not always been the most polite and engaging person. You know, he's very selfish and greedy before he becomes Iron Man. And, you know, one of his, you know, kind of mistakes in the past comes back to haunt him. Yeah, I think that one was done quite well. I think overall that has a pretty good narrative. It's not just kind of one person who wants revenge. There's different angles and aspects of why people are, you know, targeting Iron Man, but not just Iron Man, but targeting the world in general. 4-1 is, you know, arrogance, and, you know, he's kind of thrown to earth, but in the same vein as Iron Man 2, it's kind of like Thor needs to quickly learn a lesson so he can be Thor again. I don't really feel that he gained or learned anything from his banishment, since it lasted about 5 minutes. If he had been banished from you know, Valhalla for, say, years, then fine. That would have been interesting. But because it was just over a weekend again, it was like, you're rushing the story. And I didn't feel that the theme of learning from, you know, your arrogance, learning to listen to your father or things like that, I don't feel like that was fully developed. I think the only thing that was developed nicely was Loki's kind of hatred and feeling of betrayal. That was probably the best thing. Thor 2. Don't really know what the theme was there. Thor had to save the world. Captain America, the first Avenger, yeah, you know, he's the underdog. He has to go and, you know, he has his strong sense of morals, but he's too weak to do it, but he gets the power to, you know, be strong enough to defeat the bad guy. And, you know, it's all about, you know, holding tight to your, you know, to your beliefs. But again, it's, you know, he's never really put in a compromising situation throughout the film where he needs to justify his beliefs. It's all very kind of surface, and you just accept it because he is Captain America. And that's really about as deep as it goes. With Captain America, Winter Soldier, and with Civil War, I mean, the themes are all about, you know, really about betrayal. You know, they kind of have the exact same theme. I really feel like Civil War is basically Winter Soldier Part 2. Winter Soldier is you know, exploring the betrayal of the government and the establishment that he believes in, and then Civil War is about the betrayal of his friends and colleagues. Again, neither of those films put him in a situation that makes him question his beliefs, which again would have been quite interesting to see, you know, Captain America questioning why does he believe what he believes. The Avengers obviously dealt with, you know, life's great lie, you know, freedom. That was done, again, it's an interesting theme, and you have the whole kind of chaos of, you know, Loki wanting to take over the world, but instead of people kind of follow government blindly, they should just follow him because they're not free anyway, they're all bound by something. The surface of it is scratched. There's no real digging deep into that meaning. How does that affect the Avengers? How does that affect S.H.I.E.L.D.? How does that affect, you know, what Loki is doing? Is he free, or is he a subject of Thanos? A lot of things within that theme that they could have explored throughout the Avengers, but, you know, they really wanted to make it a big spectacular epic battle film after, you know, the whole kind of phase 1 was coming to a conclusion. And you have like Guardians of the Galaxy, where, you know, for them it's all about, you know, they're a part of this galaxy, so what happens to, you know, one area of the galaxy kind of, you know, eventually affect them, and that's kind of why they eventually band together. And it's all about that camaraderie, really, between, you know, a mismatched group of people trying to somehow thrust together and trying to do the right thing for the universe, trying to not be selfish, and do something for the greater good of the universe. I think that's done quite well. I think there are other elements that kind of hurt Guardians of the Galaxy. I think with the main protagonist characters, it's done nicely. And then of course you have Ant-Man, which is, you know, he wants to do right by his daughter, and that's kind of it. So with the, you know, X-Men themes, they dive into these themes and they really explore them from beginning to end. You know, for example, X-Men 1, you know, Magneto, not only does he want the people to understand what it's like to be a mutant and be cast out from what people consider the norm, he's also coming at it from the angle of being a survivor of the Holocaust. He's like, you want to brand me as a Jew, you want to, you know, segregate me because I'm a Jew, now you want to brand me because I'm a mutant, you want to segregate me because I'm a mutant. He goes, you know, well fine, then you will understand what it's like to be segregated. His motives, though evil, are understandable. I get it. It's not great. He's a bad guy and he's going to do bad things, but I get it. And then of course you have Xavier, who's like, no, there is a peaceful way of going about this. You know, we don't have to worry about a, you know, registration act. We can do this differently. You know, we can show the government that we are good people with special abilities. We are special, but that doesn't mean that we are a threat. I think you look at something like X-Men 2, where, you know, it's all about, it's belonging, but there's also a theme of kind of pain and loss throughout that entire film. And that's touched upon with every character, really. You know, not only is Wolverine dealing with the difficulty of not being able to express his emotions fully for someone like Jean, he's also dealing with the difficulty of, you know, learning about his past and where he came from. What was he? He doesn't really understand what kind of a monster he actually was during the Weapon X program, and he's starting to piece that stuff together. But then you have, you know, people like Bobby, who goes to his parents and they ostracize him because he's a mutant. Like, no, we don't want anything to do with you. If you can't stop this, then you're not our son anymore. But then you also have people like Nightcrawler, who's like, oh, people hated me, they laughed at me, they made fun of me because I was different, but I didn't hate them, I pitied them. And he really helps Storm to kind of understand, you know, why we shouldn't fear or hate humans, you know, for, you know, their persecution of us, you know, learning about forgiveness. It's very, very interesting and very deep. It's explored nicely throughout the characters, from the beginning to the end. And then, of course, you know, you have, you know, Scott, who, you know, feels that he is, you know, losing Jean, not because he's losing her necessarily to the Wolverine, but because there is something ticking in her that isn't right. And then by the end, they lose her, you know, she dies, and that affects the entire team, and you really feel the impact of her death. And I think themes with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, though interesting from time to time, are never fully explored. They're kind of sugar-coated themes. It's like, oh, yep, here's a little bit of theme that we're going to sprinkle across the top. It's going to be there. It's going to kind of, you know, be some of the motivation behind the story, but, you know, by the end of the film, we're going to see our characters, you know, kind of back to where they were at the beginning, you know, happy-go-lucky kind of stuff, really. And that's what can be a little bit frustrating with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You know, they experience things like, you know, aliens coming out of the sky, and what's been the repercussions of that. Only Iron Man 3 is the only film to really explore one of the characters and how that affected them with Tony's PTSD stuff. Everyone else just kind of gets on with it. Don't really feel that Captain America experienced that much craziness to just be cool with aliens falling from the sky. Which films explored their themes nicely? I'd say with Marvel, it would probably be Iron Man 1, Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy, Iron Man 3, and then Winter Soldier. The key ones that had their themes and brought about some sort of change and progression by the end of it. I mean, Winter Soldier had a pretty big effect on, you know, the rest of the cinematic universe. But I'd say the worst would be films like, you know, Age of Ultron. What was that? That film was just sloppy. They wanted to kind of recreate that kind of mass chaos of the Avengers, but they did it with a weak, too comedic villain. Iron Man 2, terrible. What they were doing with those themes, absolutely terrible. I would say the same thing with Thor 1. I didn't feel that Thor has learned anything. I feel he's still the same guy we see at the beginning of Thor 1 even now. Sure, he might have just a couple of notches different, but not enough to make me feel like he's learned or progressed anything from all this stuff. Say Civil War, because at the beginning of the film, you know, Cap and Iron Man, they're kind of going head to head, and they're going head to head over stupid reasons. All they really need to do is sit down and have one quick conversation, and Cap say, Bucky's being framed, this is how I know it. And they're like, oh, yep, cool, let's go fix it then. But because it's all kind of hinged on not speaking, it's just a bit stupid in parts. But then they go through this huge civil war, and then by the end of it, Cap and his guys were all broken out of prison. He saved them all, and they're in Wakanda, and, you know, the Winter Soldier's being put back in the cryostasis, and then Iron Man's back at the Avenger complex, and he's like, yep, cool, everything's cool, yep, got a letter from Cap, he'll come back anytime we need him, and that's what I want. And it's like, well, we've not progressed. We've gone right back to what we wanted at the beginning. I thought if there was a film that needed to end on a downbeat, Civil War was that film. Those guys should not have been saved from prison. You know, Cap should have just been off somewhere on his own, and Iron Man should have been probably depressed, losing everyone and everything that has been built for the past, you know, however many films. So I thought that was a tremendous letdown, because it would have made the big triumphant return for Infinity War so much more triumphant. Now it's just kind of like, oh yeah, you know, you expect them all to get back together because they have to. They could have done it a lot better. And I think films that have just been relatively pointless, Thor 2, Ant-Man, Captain America, the first Avenger, and the Hulk film, you know, the themes and what those characters go through in those films is just kind of like, yep, here's a film, here's an action superhero film, here's your villain, let's go fight it, and yay, kind of stuff. So it's kind of like, all right, you know, you've done your stuff, and we've been mildly entertained, and that's fine, and we just go on. When I see these superhero films, I mean, Bryan Singer always says that comic books are kind of the modern day kind of, you know, Greek mythology kind of tales, and that's true. And Greek myths, you know, they always tell these very interesting character themes and stories through these grand epics, and that's what the X-Men does. Even when X-Men are at their worst, with say things like X-Men 3 and Wolverine Origins, you know, there are still interesting themes happening. The MCU, I don't feel that those themes that they explore are as deep or as rich as what they could be. And there's a reason some of these themes work better in the X-Men than they do in the MCU villains. X-Men have had a whole host of villains that have come into contact over the past, you know, 9 films that they've had or whatever. Trask, the Phoenix, Stryker, Viper, Silver Samurai, Apocalypse, Sebastian Shaw. In minor aspects, they have other people like, you know, Lady Deathstrike, Toad, Sabretooth, Pyro. The X-Men deal with a lot of different villains. What is unique about their approach to the villains is similar to kind of Sam Raimi's approach to the Spider-Man villains that he has. Most of these villains have some sort of personal connection with the other side. You know, you have Stryker, who is connected to the Wolverine. He's also connected to Nightcrawler. You know, you have Professor Xavier and Magneto, who are both mutants fighting the same war, but at very different ends of the spectrum. Sebastian Shaw is strongly connected to Magneto as well. You know, the Silver Samurai has a connection to the Wolverine. You know, people like Trask, who he falls into the kind of Stryker territory, where he's trying to, you know, use his mad science to manipulate mutants and hunt mutants and that kind of stuff. What makes the relationships nice is you actually feel that there's a reason why these characters are battling each other. You know, it's one of those things where you look at the friendship that Xavier has with Magneto and how it breaks Xavier's heart that they just can't be real friends, that they just can't be on the same side. Look at someone like Iceman. You know, his best friend Pyro goes to the other side, and you know, he eventually has to fight and take down his best friend, and that's interesting. You're like, oh, you know, these guys used to be best friends, and now they're having to fight each other because one has basically become a terrorist. You have a real sense of emotion behind these villains, even the ones that aren't massive. So for example, Lady Deathstrike in X-Men 2, we know that she is under Stryker's control, and eventually what happens, Wolverine, you know, he shoves that squirt gun of adamantium in her stomach and fills her full of liquid metal and kills her. It's so tragic about that scene. You see her eyes kind of ungloss over, and she starts to return to normal, but Wolverine's already killed her, and you're like, gosh, you know, before she was just a killing machine, but man, she was actually a person. Maybe if you would have waited a few more seconds, she wouldn't have had to have died. I feel that impact with the heroes and the villains in the X-Men universe. Sadly for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, their weakest link is their villains. The best villains that they've had is Obadiah Stane from Iron Man 1, Loki, and the Winter Soldier. Beyond that, everyone else is very one-dimensional. It's more like, we need a villain, here's a generic villain. Malekith for Thor 2. What is he? He's just some guy, some elf from a dark world who wants to take over the universe. Okay, cool, whatever. There's no emotional connection to that villain, so you're just kind of like, great, generic villain. Same thing with Ronan from Guardians of the Galaxy. Easily the weakest bit. Probably the more interesting dynamic with villainry is Gamora and Nebula. But yeah, Ronan, well boring. Darren Cross from Ant-Man, he's just super generic evil mad scientist. Not very interesting at all, which is a shame because the actor is great and he was brilliant in House of Cards, so don't know why they went so bland with that. Red Skull, again, it's like, you know, you have Cap's arch enemy, and it's hammy and weak, and it's just enough to get the film to the end, and that's about it really. Really bad ones like Whiplash and Justin Hammer, and you know, that they just don't work. They're weak, aren't interesting, or they're too funny. I mean, Justin Hammer, he's just cracking jokes and dancing on stage, and you're like, you're a weapons guy. No weapons guy would be coming out dancing on stage like he's a rock star. Let's make these villains scary and interesting, whereas they just haven't been. And within the Thor universe, you have the Frost Giants, who are the kind of the main villains of Thor, and you're like, okay, whatever, kind of stupid. So I was really bored with the Frost Giants. I'd say Crossbones in Civil War is, again, a terrible villain. It's like, okay, you have this cool guy and he's in it for about 5 seconds and then he's like destroyed completely. You know, he blows himself up and then he's gone. It's like, this guy was supposed to be the guy who kills Captain America and you kill him in the first 5 minutes of the film. Why? While I liked what they did with Zemo, it's interesting to see someone who is powerless dismantle the Avengers. Like, that was kind of interesting. But why call him Zemo? You know, do something else. You know, he's just another guy who lost his family. Civil War, you know, for me, both theme and villainry wise, felt like I was watching 2 films. I felt like I was watching, you know, Winter Soldier Part 2 and then, you know, Avengers Age of Ultron, the aftermath. A lot of interesting things happening, maybe too much is happening. It was a film that kind of should have been bigger but dialed back a little bit. Now we're going to talk about relationships. X-Men is interesting because you're more invested in just the relationship between the people. From the very beginning of the X-Men film universe, I've always believed in the relationships. I always believe that these are genuine friends, people who know each other, people who get on, people who hang out 24/7, whether they're on the bad side or the good side. When they explore some of the themes of, you know, loss and pain, it makes it all the more impacting because I believe in their relationship. I believe that Wolverine and Scott hate each other to a certain point, but then that's what makes Days of Future Past so powerful at the end when Scott is back and Wolverine's just like, it's good to see you, mate. But then you have that interesting dynamic between Xavier and Magneto, which I mentioned earlier. You know, their friendship is a very interesting and integral part to X-Men. But then you have other aspects, things like the Wolverine and Rogue relationship, where she's, you know, she's very young. She's trying to understand her, you know, life and where she fits in. And Wolverine quite sweetly is like, I'm gonna take this kid under my wing. You know, he feels oddly responsible for her and kind of parental over her. And there are love relationships in this stuff as well. You know, in X-Men First Class, the kind of Beast Mystique relationship was quite sweet because they're all young and naive and freshmen in college kind of stuff. But then you also have someone like Xavier who meets Moira McTaggart and they have this kind of working relationship, and then painfully at the end, after they kiss, you know, he erases her memory because he feels that it's safer for the X-Men to, you know, cut all their ties with the government. And that was painful for him because you eventually see in X-Men Apocalypse that he's actually not forgotten about her. You know, yes, he has looked her up from time to time, and they rekindle their relationship throughout X-Men Apocalypse, and it's quite sweet. And then at the end, he returns her memories because he's like, I shouldn't have done that. You know, it kind of touches upon that, you know, what should you be doing with your powers, Xavier? Do you have the right to take her memories away? You don't. That was interesting that, you know, you see their kind of their relationship grow and blossom. The quite sweet relationship between Jean and Scott at the, you know, in X-Men Apocalypse, where they meet for the first time and, you know, they're kind of learning about each other and their powers and thrown together in this epic adventure. Then of course in the, you know, the main trilogy, you believe in that relationship. You believe that Scott and Jean are a couple with a long history. They're not just kind of thrown together at the beginning of the film. It's like, yeah, you know, I believe in that relationship. But then you go to relationships in the MCU. I mean, when it comes to the love relationships, that is by far the shittiest thing I've ever seen on film. Tony and Pepper probably get by with a B- for being kind of realistic, but they just drop characters at, you know, just because they can't fit them all into a film. So you're kind of like, ugh, you know, Iron Man's going through all this shit and he's not being like, you know, Pepper, they're like broken up in Civil War. You're writing these people in and out, you know, just willy-nilly, and it's ridiculous. So don't have that relationship in there. I mean, Thor and Jane, what the hell? Who believes that relationship? And I gotta be honest, even the Captain America Peggy or the Captain America Sharon love interests, I'm like, ugh, I didn't buy him. Captain America's the First Avenger needed a lot more for me to believe in Peggy and you know, Steve Rogers' relationship. You were just kind of forced to see what was happening rather than actually watch things naturally progress. And then of course you have, you know, the Hulk and Black Widow, which when I first saw Age of Ultron, I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting and kind of out of the blue, wasn't expecting that. Had a couple of interestingly sweet moments. But then it's like, that really came out of nowhere. The first Avengers film hinted at strongly that the Black Widow and Hawkeye had some relationship, but now he's got a family with kids and she's with Hulk. And you're like, so, okay, all right, so that was a friendly relationship that they had, not a, you know, boyfriend-girlfriend kind of thing. It's like they're throwing things at you and you have to quickly accept it. And it shouldn't work like that. But sure, then you have other relationships. One thing I've always been waiting for is this epic Iron Man Captain America friendship. I mean, they used to be really good friends and then they get torn apart. I kind of feel like they've never become solid friends. They've been kind of borderline putting up with each other, but you know, I haven't really felt that they've established a good solid relationship. Like, so when you look at these relationships, you kind of go back to the villains and you're like, part of what makes the X-Men so interesting is the relationship, the connection between some of the villains. And because the heroes a lot of the times don't have a deep connection with their villains, it weakens the motive and it weakens the urgency behind some of the plots. You know, I do think some characters, you know, I do think they get on. I think, you know, when you have the team aspect going on, you're kind of like, yeah, you know, that's the Avengers, you know, that looks like a comic book, I can believe that. The one scene in Age of Ultron that I thought was enjoyable, well, many scenes that were enjoyable, but one that I really did like was the party scene at Stark Tower, because it's like, finally, we're actually seeing characters just hanging out. I mean, some of the, you know, best scenes in the X-Men films are when the guys are just hanging out. It makes for fun engagement time. It's, you know, when you kind of step away from the urgency and the drama that's happening and just let yourselves be normal, that's when you get some of the best, you know, character development. You know, X-Men First Class, when they're all exploring their powers, or when Wolverine is having a cold soda with Bobby. That stuff is fun, whereas the MCU is just, everything is always surrounded around, you know, government building, this is happening. Iron Man does well to kind of be separate from a lot of the government junk, even though the Tony is in weapons. You know, the first film and the third film are very good character films. You know, I enjoyed a lot of what they did with that. Again, I think that's what made Iron Man 1 work, was the relationship between Obadiah Stane and Iron Man. And I think that's what made Iron Man 3 work, the you know, the relationship with him and the Mandarin, or their version of the Mandarin. And MCU films that I mentioned where the themes work are also the ones that have the best kind of character stuff as well. You know, so I think, you know, Avengers worked quite nicely to throw everyone together and get them to kind of meet and you know, put their differences aside quickly so they can focus on the villain. Guardians of the Galaxy, again, is a great example of, you know, this ragtag group of people coming together, and as they're learning about each other and trying to resolve, you know, their issues and what they're trying to do, you still have that, you know, that selfishness and greed that they're dealing with as they eventually go towards the greater good of the universe, which is cool. Again, Iron Man 3. I would say the Winter Soldier has good character development in there, because it's an emotional story for Cap, because it's all about finding Bucky and saving Bucky. I think the disappointing thing with that is they didn't get him by the end, and then it spills over into Civil War. They should have, if they could contain that and get that all done in Winter Soldier, whether that means he's back in cryostasis or whatever, that would have been a little bit better, because Cap was dealing with Nick Fury lying, but also dealing with, you know, trying to, you know, find his friend who he's just found out is alive. That was interesting. You know, that's why that is one of the best, you know, Marvel films, because character-wise and emotion-wise, it's pushing the characters forward, and that's what I like. It's just a shame that those kind of relationships and stuff like that aren't done throughout the entire MCU. Finally, growth. You know, when you look at the X-Men films, when you look at X-Men 1 to 3, you see character growth. You know, you see Xavier is not the same Xavier by the third film. Neither is Scott, neither is Wolverine, neither is Jean. You know, they've all grown and learned. Wolverine is not who he is in the end of X-Men 3. End of X-Men 3, he's kind of hopeful, but then he's struggling with the loss of Jean, that he's like, I'm out of here. You know, so you see from film to film the impact that happens from those stories. Everything is cohesive, you know, it's moving forward, and characters are continuously changing and evolving. The MCU keeps the characters within their shell. Iron Man is the smartass rich billionaire superhero guy. Gotcha. Captain America is the red, white, and blue patriot guy. James Rhodes is the best friend of Iron Man and works for the government. Hulk is the big angry green guy. Black Widow is the, you know, I got a sketchy past and we're never going to explore it because I don't know why. Everyone just kind of maintains. You know, the most character development that we've actually had for someone is Hawkeye. It's like, oh, suddenly he's got a family and a farm that he's kept secret because he doesn't want them to be targeted by bad guys. The farm scene in Age of Ultron, which mimicked the farm scene in Ninja Turtles, is probably the best scene in the entire film, because again, it stops and lets the characters engage and chat and, you know, grow together. Everything the MCU has experienced. By the end of Civil War, when everyone is happy and smiling and like making jokes, you're just kind of like, after all of this, you're still cool. Like, you know, Cap, yep, I'm always going to be there for you, Tony. And then Tony's like, yep, he's always going to be there for me, so hopefully I can work it out and get them to come back. It's just like, ugh. It becomes grating because you want these characters to feel real and to feel like they're progressing, and, you know, the events that are happening to them, you want it to feel like it's actually affecting them. I really can't say that I feel like it is. I feel like it's just this week in the MCU, you know, and it's solved by the end of the film and everything goes back to normal. I don't want that, but that's really what it has been. Like, X-Men have a much better balance of seriousness and humor, whereas I kind of feel like the MCU has become overly reliant on their humor. Everyone kind of knows, oh yeah, let's go see a, you know, Marvel film. It's going to be, you know, fun action adventure humor kind of stuff, which is fine, but, you know, I think every once in a while it's important to shake up the tone, make yourself a little bit different, reinvent yourself so that people aren't always expecting the same thing. I think that's kind of why Marvel have churned out positive film after positive film, because they've kept so tightly to their formula that they haven't allowed for growth. Iron Man 1 kicked off the MCU in such a realistic way, but I think they're missing a trick that things like, you know, franchises like the X-Men, you know, where they balance the humor and the seriousness a little bit better. You know, that's what the MCU haven't been able to do, and that's something they really need to be able to get a grip on. So here we are at the end. X-Men versus the MCU. Who wins? To be honest, no one really wins. I enjoy both of them, but I do think that I gravitate more towards one for those particular reasons that I've just gone through. I would like to see the MCU kind of recharge itself and break new territory, and I feel they've done that a little bit with things like Guardians of the Galaxy. They very well might do that again with like Doctor Strange, but they need to really start taking a bit more chances. There haven't been a lot of risks, you know. In the Marvel films, I mean, who's really died that's been an impact, you know? When Quicksilver died in Age of Ultron, I didn't give a care. He was a character who was barely in it, barely spoke, and then got shot in the end. It's like, whatever. They're not going to kill off anyone important, are they? Groot dying in Guardians of the Galaxy was probably the most traumatic death in the Marvel Cinematic Universe so far, because it's like, oh, Groot. You know, and we already know that this new version of Groot is he the same Groot? Is he different? We know there's going to be some differences there, which is important because he can't just go back to being the same Groot. There has to be consequences for people's actions. And I'd say the one place where the MCU are really getting their characters, their development, their grit is absolutely on Netflix. You know, Daredevil seasons 1 and 2 are kick-ass. Jessica Jones is, again, a very interesting and deep and dark show. You know, what they do with those shows, it would be nice if they could transplant some of that into their films, because it just makes for richer stories, and that's what, you know, we need to see more of. What do you think? Do you think the X-Men franchise is better or has stronger points than the MCU? Comment and let me know.